my name is Ali Martinez. I'm a city council moderator. I've been moderating for the past 5 years. And today we're having our panel over the legalization and regulation of prostitution, as well as its possible benefits and costs. And this is to inform city leaders and government officials. Before we begin, let me introduce you to our panelists for today. We have Debbie Tyson, who is an international human rights attorney. Next is Andrew Hall, who is a doctor with Doctors Without Borders. Then we have Xochitl Gonzalez, who is our prostitute abolitionist. Sharmisia Dotson is a lawyer with Sherry's Ranch, a brothel in Nevada. And last but not least, we have Brianna Chacon, who is a global economist with a focus in solicitation of sex. Panelists, each of you will have 1 minute to answer your question. I ask that you have respect for one another and do not speak while another is speaking. Audience, at this time, I ask that you silence your cell phones, and any questions that you have, please hold until after Q&A, or until after the panel for our Q&A. With that being said, let's begin. This first question goes to all of our panelists. We'll start with Debbie and go on down the road. Do you believe that prostitution should be legalized, and why?
I am for a consensual and strictly structured form of sex work that minimizes violence, health implications, and the devaluing of women. There are legal provisions through normalization of sexual practices that can take away these negative connotations of prostitution, such as individual discrimination, exploitation, and abuse of women. According to the New Internationalist, about 71% of women from India willingly turn to prostitution, just as others turn to other forms of domestic construction and agricultural labor as informal work sources. While we must accept that some women have preferences to turn to sex work as a legitimate form of work, we have to realize that they say the harm is in its illegal and hidden nature. With that being said, we have to realize that sex workers must be positioned as equal citizens and be included civically and socially.
Thank you. Andrew?
Hello, my name is Andrew Hall, and I am not for the legalization of prostitution, mostly because it's one of the unhealthiest activities there is. According to the Washington Post, in 2001, the German parliament basically made prostitution legal. This made brothels overcrowded and raised sexually transmitted disease rates dramatically. This also raised sex trafficking rates, and it also made the brothels very, very crowded. Legalizing it would not make it safer, and it just would not be a good thing.
Thank you. Xochitl?
Hi, my name is Xochitl Gonzalez, and I am against legalization of prostitution. Instead of legalizing prostitution, I believe we should take a women's equality standpoint, as Sweden did, and decriminalize the buyers. Prostitution declines when you criminalize the buyers. This is according to the Women's Front in Sweden. If you legalize prostitution, it increases demand and it affects how society views women. And it's a man imposing his sexuality on a woman, and it actually does not increase safety according to the Women's Frontline in Sweden. In places like Germany where it is legalized, violence often increases in the red light district. And it doesn't increase safety because the missing, killing, and abuse of prostitutes is a man's violence issue. It's not a prostitution issue.
Thank you. Sharmisia?
Hi, I'm Tracy Dodson, and I am for the legalization of prostitution. To echo Melissa Digmore, a research consultant to the Sex Workers Project, my view of the sex industry is that if we treat it as a work and address some of its dangers, it would be less dangerous. It's time to stop looking at prostitution as on a moral grounds and start looking at it as the business that it is, as the goods that are being transpired, and focusing on it. When we focus on it as in a business aspect, we start to really see all the great economic benefits that can come from this.
Thank you. And last we'll hear from Brianna.
My name is Brianna Chacon, and I am for the regulation and legalization of prostitution, as it is the oldest profession in the world today. Now, as Eric Dye said from FindingJustice.org, there are 40 million prostitutes at work today, and that is greater than the population of Canada and Australia put together. Now, on top of that, it's legal and regulated in more than 22 countries around the world. And in these 22 countries, they have some of the largest economic backgrounds and economic statuses. 1 in 10 men are doing business with prostitution today. Now, if we take that ratio and compare it against the entire world population, you can see how many men are in the world and how many men actually engage in the business of prostitution. Now, I'd like to focus on demographics, on countries and places and cultures around the world that have it legalized and
10
regulated,
seconds.
because in that sense, it's more of a choice and they are not being forced into prostitution. Thank you.
Thank you. This next question goes to Sharnicia and Brianna. What are some of the economic benefits of prostitution?
So legalizing prostitution can no doubt increase the economy of a government locally and on a federal level. Business Insider recently did a piece on my client Sherry's Ranch, and over the past couple of years, my client has had to spend over $20 million in getting proper licensing for his brothel, and that's just one brothel out of 18 in Nevada, and these are all located in rural areas. So if we were to increase the scope of prostitution to more bigger cities, then that government would be making a lot of money, and that could be used to help fund different projects and needs in different governments and really expand local economies. So great economic benefits to prostitution.
Brianna?
Well, the economic benefits to prostitution, according to BBC, it is legal in the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands it does restrict the black market if prostitution is legal. Last year, well, per year, they raised 250 million euros in tax revenue, and it's treated as an ordinary business, whereas it competes with any other industry, such as we have cultural, just other industries in the business. And it is involuntary. If it's involuntary and underage, then it is illegal. Now, according to John Turley-Ewert of National Post, Germany has received bad press about the decriminalization and saying that it's beneficial to the black market, whereas actually the opposite is true. And prostitution is just like any other industry. If you make it illegal, you give criminals a monopoly. But if you
10
make
seconds.
it legal, you give law-abiding enterprises a chance to compete with the industry.
Thank you. What are the health risks of legalizing prostitution? This goes to Debbie and Sochi. So we'll start with Debbie.
The majority of anti-prostitution advocates would say that prostitution is a form of sexual and physical harassment, economic coercion, and also verbal abuse. In detail, many prostitutes are subject to violence and STDs such as HIV, AIDS, chlamydia, and syphilis. On the other hand, it is shown that prostitution can cause a number of unwanted pregnancies and even miscarriages. Some of the health consequences of prostitution through their mental consequences are trauma, depression, anxiety, eating disorders, and self-medication through alcohol and drug abuse. According to the Coalition Against Human Trafficking for Women, about 70% of sex workers met the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, and they constitute 15% of all committed suicides.
Next we'll hear from Sochi.
Okay, so just to expand a little bit on what Debbie was saying about the mental health issues with prostitution, sexuality is a part of our personality. We all have things that turn us on and turn us off, but prostitutes don't really get to know what the reality is of their own sexuality because they're so focused on pleasing someone else, and they lose the part of their sexuality. According to the Prostitution Research and Education Center, 67% of prostitutes develop PTSD, which is the same rate among veterans, showing that it takes a really large psychological toll on women. Harassment, like I said earlier, is more likely to occur in places where prostitution is legalized because men see it as the government telling them it's okay. As long as you pay for it, you can do whatever you want. And it's mostly poor women and girls who have to turn to prostitution as their only source of income. And instead of making this an issue about like women's choice, it's mostly an issue about the economic suffrage of women.
Thank you. This next question goes to Sharnicia. This will also be Sharnicia's last question for today's panel. Would businesses be responsible for preventing the spread of illness?
So not only will future businesses be responsible for preventing the spread of illnesses, but according to Nevada state law, it is their responsibility. In Nevada, you cannot get a license to own a brothel unless you require a regular treatment and testing of different illnesses such as HIV and other forms of sexually transmitted diseases. My client goes above and beyond and not only does regular screenings on a bi-weekly basis for HIV and AIDS, but also does checks of the clients because clients also are not free of disease, so we do a check of both. So yes, it is the responsibility of business. And in conclusion, if we stop looking, it's time to stop looking at prostitution on a moral grounds and start really looking at it as a business that it is. If two consenting adults agree to exchange these goods in a capitalist economy, why should we stop them?
Thank you. Our next question goes to Andrew and Brianna. And for Brianna, this will be her last question for this panel. Should the legalization of prostitution be limited to certain cities? We'll start with Andrew.
I do not believe that the legalization of prostitution should be limited to certain cities. I don't think we should legalize it at all because this would affect neighboring cities and it would also lead to spreads of different sexually transmitted diseases. It would also make it a lot harder for law enforcement to enforce the law upon if it was legal in some cities and illegal in other cities. It would also lead to an unhealthy lifestyle in that city, and legalizing it would definitely make the problem a lot greater. It wouldn't make the problem less.
Thank you. And we'll hear from Brianna.
Well, according to Pano Rady, on behalf of prostitution in Finland, it is illegal if it is purchased in public, and it can only be purchased in private areas such as off online, or even doing so out in the suburban areas. It is banned if it involves human trafficking or if the provider of the service is underage. Now, this also compares to Las Vegas in a sense that, according to Nevada state law, it is legal in counties, but only in counties that have less than a population of 400,000, which leaves out Las Vegas. And leaving out Las Vegas could leave out a huge business transaction that could happen due to their great population and their interaction with other individuals. Now, they have to be at least 21, but in other counties they can be 18. And outside licensed brothels, it is illegal and becomes a misdemeanor. But from an economic standpoint, limiting legalization and regulation across cities actually makes it harder to regulate, and it minimizes business transactions. And as this is my last question, I would like to say.
This next question goes to Debbie and Andrew, and for both of them, this will be their last response. Is there a big enough demand for prostitution to legalize it? Debbie.
We could definitely say that there is a demand for prostitution through several intermediaries such as pimps, tourism, the entertainment industry, and the military that support it as a lucrative economic venture. But the state's decision to legalize prostitution comes with high responsibility for structure and safety and to ensure morality. This includes improvement in the legal, labor, and social conditions of sex workers. We could do this through zoning of prostitution areas, or we could ensure that brothel owners are practicing safe sex and preventing STDs, and we could also have them check their clients for police background tests. With that being said, thank you. My name is Debbie Tyson, and in conclusion, I am neutral about the legalization and regulation of prostitution.
Andrew.
According to the National Institute of Justice, most of the arrests involving the crime of prostitution are the prostitutes themselves. Only about 10% of the time it is of the customer, either the man or woman buying the services. That being said, it does not seem there's a high enough demand to legalize this crime. Also, there's definitely not a high enough demand if most of the time the prostitutes themselves are getting arrested for their own business. And that being said, I am not for the legalization of prostitution because it is an unsafe and unhealthy practice.
Thank you. This will be our final question for today's panel, and we'll hear it from Soji. Is there a double standard in the criminalization of prostitution?
As my co-panelist Andrew said, there is a double standard if it is the women mostly getting arrested. In 1949, the United Nations adopted a treaty of fighting prostitution, pornography, and human trafficking because they see them as being intertwined. Men feel entitled to a certain type of sex that they see in pornographies, and they buy prostitutes to satisfy these fantasies. A prostitute is not choosing what she wants to get done to her body. A man is paying to please her if he wants to, when he wants to, and how he wants to. Choosing prostitution is as much as a choice as choosing poverty, and men believe that sex is consensual because you're paying for it, and this is part of the fantasy. If it was really that great, you wouldn't have to pay for it. And in conclusion, I am against the legalization of prostitution.
Thank you. This concludes our panel for today. Before we move on to Q&A, I'd like to briefly recap each of our panelists' main points. Debbie pinpointed that structured legalization and regulation of prostitution ensures safety. Andrew discussed the health risks and dangers of legalizing prostitution. Sochi discussed the generalization of sexual power between prostitutes and their clients. Sharnicia discussed the legalization of prostitution and how it's a great business opportunity with economic gains. And last, we had Brianna, who discussed the economic benefits of countries that have legalized prostitution versus those that have not. And thank you, panelists, for being here today. Thank you, audience, for joining us. And now I open the floor to Q&A.
My question is for Sharnicia. What effects does prostitution have on sex trafficking?
So, Sharnicia, the audience member asked, what effects does prostitution have on sex trafficking?
So actually, legalizing prostitution would actually reduce violence against women. In a study found in San Francisco, they found that 82% of street prostitutes had been assaulted and 68% had been raped while young, and they're 18 times more likely to be murdered than non-prostitutes their age and race. And what this comes down to is sex workers prostitutes don't feel comfortable enough going to police officers to report these certain things, and so are more likely to go into sex trafficking, while sex workers in licensed brothels feel comfortable going to their boss of sorts who can handle those types of situations better, so they're in a more safer environment.
This question is for Sharnicia as well. I was curious, you guys talked about it being a one-time exchange of goods, but there are long-term repercussions from sex. You can have a baby, and you can get sexually transmitted diseases. Who would be responsible in those situations, in a situation where someone were to get pregnant or get an STD?
So the audience member asks, who would be responsible for pregnancy of a prostitute?
Okay, well, at Sherry's Ranch, my client, they require that all of the prostitutes have sex with condoms. That is mandatory. You cannot have sex without a condom in that brothel, and in most brothels that is the case. There haven't been instances yet of that, so there, in terms of a child being born, it just hasn't happened, and we take all the precautionaries to make sure that that doesn't happen. Whether that is women going on the pill, and always mandatory condoms. So we try to really prevent that from happening.
Thank you. We have time for one quick question.
All right, this is for Sochi. Do you think that prostitutes themselves want prostitution legalized?
So Sochi, the audience member asked, do you think that prostitutes themselves want prostitution legalized?
I don't believe they want prostitution legalized. According to the Education and Research Center of Prostitution, 89% of prostitutes were sexually abused as children, and the entering age for prostitution internationally is 12 to 14 years old, so it's really hard to say that that's a personal choice, considering they're not even mature enough to be making a decision, I believe.
That concludes our Q&A for today. Again, thank you panelists, thank you audience. Have a good afternoon.